Hi, this is Richard Edelman, and you're listening to The Trust Makers.
Hi, I'm Alex Heath, U.S. Head of Social Impact and Sustainability. I'm joined by Kristin Lord, the President and CEO of IREX, a global nonprofit dedicated to development and education. Kristin has an extensive background leading nonprofits and working in academics. Prior to joining IREX, Kristin was the acting president and EVP at the United States Institute of Peace, a fellow at the Brookings Institute, and an associate dean at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Kristin, welcome to the Trust Makers.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here.
As I mentioned in your introduction, IREX is a global development and education organization. Can you tell our listeners a little more about what work you do on the ground?
IREX is a global education and development nonprofit that promotes more just, prosperous, and inclusive societies around the world. And we do that by engaging and empowering youth, cultivating leaders at all levels of society, strengthening educational, cultural, and governing institutions, and extending access to quality education and information. So the way we are different from a lot of other international development organizations that you might know, Alex, is that we're not a humanitarian organization. We do not meet anybody's basic needs. We don't feed anybody. We don't house anybody. We never gave a vaccine in our lives. But we're really investing in the education and the skills and the experiences of people so that they can improve not just their own lives, but the lives of people around them.
I think it's a really important point that you bring up. Those of us who spend time in this space understand the difference between a development organization and a humanitarian organization. As a development organization building for the future, you must work with a variety of organizations, bringing lots of different folks together to help build for that future. As you look around your work and a lot of the work that you've done in your career, what is it that makes an institution trusted in society? Because if we're going to build for the future, we have to trust our institutions.
That is so true. And that's so true here in the United States, but also around the world and in local communities. What makes an organization trusted, according to decades and decades of scholarship, are two things. First, do institutions deliver on what people expect them to be delivering on? So if you're a teacher, do your children feel that they have learned something? And do parents feel their children have learned something? If you are a government official, is the trash getting picked up? Are the roads getting paved? Are those services being provided? So that's the first one. The second one, scholars call benevolence. And really what they mean by that is, are you doing things for the right reasons? Are you doing things to serve others' interests or just your own? So again, take the example of a local government official. Do people think when they vote for you that you're in it for them, that you're there to serve their interests and meet their needs? Or is that official seen as someone who's lining their own pockets, giving contracts to cronies? And so that's that marriage of what Edelman calls competence and values. Scholars call competence and benevolence, and that's the theory. But what we find at IREX is that this plays out in real life. We see these patterns again and again and again, whether it's in Ukraine or Moldova or Kenya or Guatemala, or where you've spent some time, Alex, Thailand. People want the same things from their leaders at the most basic level.
For the first 19 years of the Edelman Trust Barometer, NGOs were the most trusted institution of the four institutions we study. But starting in 2021, right around the time of COVID-19, business became the most trusted. Why do you think that was a turning point for businesses and for NGOs?
I think it's clearer for businesses that there was a direct correlation with COVID. Frankly, I think businesses stepped up. I think businesses were flexible. I think they provided a lot of services to their people. I think they really became places where people could connect. They became a haven. And I think business leaders really stepped up to meet a lot of needs. Looking back at the data, I don't recall a steep decline in trust of NGOs, more that businesses rose. I remember that as being the headline. But the question is, why haven't NGOs risen more? If they were already high, why didn't they have a surge after COVID? I don't have a definitive answer, but I'll venture a guess. One is, I do think a lot of other things coincided with the COVID crisis, like political polarization, and in the United States, at least, the 2020 election and the racial justice crisis. There were a lot of other social crises happening across a number of other countries at that time. There were a few very high-profile corruption, sexual harassment cases involving NGOs during that period. And if you throw that into a stew of general polarization, I think you see that NGOs didn't climb in anyone's trust. But like I said, I actually don't recall that they declined significantly. I thought they leveled out, but business was the one that surged, which shows that there's an opportunity. Businesses surged because they delivered for people, and people thought they were doing it for the right reasons, that employees felt genuinely looked after. And I think that goes right back to the principles we talked about at the outset.
I think that's right. And I saw the same in terms of the levels. Can you tell us a little bit about how and why follow through there is so important to building trust, and perhaps even give us an example that you've seen around how building trust through follow through is so important?
So people who follow international development closely will know that there is a real movement in the sector to what we call locally led development, where we should really be putting local organizations in front, building them up, letting them do the work. Because after all, those are the people who are going to be in the countries and live in the countries. They're the ones who are going to sustain the efforts for the long term. So this is something that's been talked about for a long time, frankly, but to a large degree, it has been all talk. I think in recent years, there has been a more genuine effort, in part because foundations and other funders like governments have forced us to do this. But also, I think there has been a bit of a moral reckoning that has reinforced that. But why is that issue of follow through and walking the walk important? Let me give an example. So when I have traveled around the world, when I have been, say I've been in Africa, and I hear from a local nonprofit that they don't trust international nonprofits, and I say, well, why is that? And they say, well, because we felt like they wanted all the attention. They wanted most of the money. They said they were here to focus on us, but what their behavior sent a different signal. And obviously that's very disheartening. But then let me give a positive side too. And every now and then, if the circumstances are right, I will say, so IREX, my organization, is an international NGO. And you just gave me an earful on how you don't trust international NGOs. Do you mind if I ask why you're working with us? And they said, oh, you're different. You're different. When we work with IREX, we feel that we're partners. We're treated as equals. We felt like you really cared. And I know we're not the only ones, by the way, who do this, but it just goes to show you how even within the same sector category, there are some organizations that are distrusted because their partners feel like they're not working with them for the right reasons. And then there are partners just from the way they do things, the how, that respect, that listening, and those subtle cues of deference to them, where that is the thing that helps them build trust.
And again, you're talking about such local level and interpersonal relationships. And that is so important as institutions build trust. And we think institutions sound big and vast, and it really is about the person-to-person relationship.
When it comes down to it, that's where you have to start. Now, I hate to be contrary, but I think we can also make a mistake if we think that just because the person on the other side of the table trusts us and we have that good working relationship, that we are trusted in a whole community. One of the points we make in a very short paper on trust building we have on our website is that we really, as international organizations, need to make sure we're not taking the easy way out and only picking the people who like us to work with, the people who speak English, the people who live in cities, the people who are super polished and have the same skill set as we do. If you think you are dealing with those people who are in many cases outliers, and you trick yourself into thinking that you're working with the broader community, you can be wrong. There are some people with that same set of qualities I mentioned who may not be trusted by their communities. So, we all really need to do our homework and make sure that the partners we are choosing are genuinely viewed by the communities we want to serve as those trusted interlocutors. And that just takes a lot of extra effort.
IREX recently published a framework for building trust in leaders and institutions. This framework identified 7 practices to foster trust. Can you tell us a little bit about these and why they're effective?
This is something we've learned at IREX, but it is also one of the most commonly accepted practices in peace building and conflict resolution. And that is, if we want to build trust between individuals or groups, the single best way, the single most proven way to do that is to put them together to address a shared challenge. Or to meet a shared objective. A lot of time and effort has gone into thinking that, if we just get to know each other a little better, we'll see that we're all human and we'll like each other better, and then we'll be able to accomplish what are, in some cases, very hard things together. It turns out that even though that getting to know you can be valuable and enriching and educational, in terms of building long-term intergroup trust, it is not as effective as putting both people on one side of the table and the problem on the other. So no matter where we are in the world or what the specific problem is, you really need to bring all the right stakeholders in and not just help them get to know each other, but really make sure that they can work together to figure out what they both have in common that they want. And the process of figuring that out together will help build trust. So imagine this. Imagine if in everything we tried to do around the world when it came to international development or education or community improvements, imagine that we were really thoughtful about how we tried to incorporate trust building as part of that exercise. We would not only get whatever we wanted, the new library built, the new activities for youth, address substance abuse, but we would also have better relationships that got left behind that would in turn enable other problem solving in communities. I would really love it if we could integrate more explicit trust building into what we're doing anyway. If we use that process to build better community relations between business and consumers, between police and citizens, between other groups that might have some reason to distrust each other, we'd all be better off.
Of the 7 practices, one of them is to make sure that we're putting folks on one side of the table and putting the challenge on the other side of the table.
It is. I think that's probably the single most important thing that we can do to build trust between groups or individuals.
And then of the other 6 practices, are there others that are equally helpful and or counterintuitive like that one?
I think a real focus on building relationships. Especially Americans, we just want to get to the point. But if we really want to have a long-term outcome, and especially in other cultures that really prize this even more than we do in our cultures, really taking the time to have a quality relationship first can make everything easier. And then when something goes wrong with that deal, you know who to call. And stuff goes wrong. That's how interactions are. That's how reality is. And so having that trusted relationship first really makes a difference. And if I could give a US example, I live in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that people who live here bemoan is that it used to be we had political parties who would fight it out in election, argue in the press, and just generally disagree. But then they'd all go and have dinner together, and their kids would play together, and they'd go to religious services together. And there was this separation between the political sphere and the human sphere. And that human sphere where you had that relationship, you could get a lot done because of that. Now I have heard, and this is not unique to the United States, by the way, I've heard this around the world, this political polarization. Now that there is this condition where people refuse to interact on a human level, cannot seem to separate the disagreement from all these other things they might have in common. I have heard it described as rooting for sports teams. You know, you're all for one team or you're all for another, and you couldn't possibly sit in the stands with the other guy if you're wearing the different colored jersey. We really see that in Washington. And I think it's detrimental not just to our politics, but to our policies. And I think it is getting in the way of solving some very real problems. But that part of it is not unique to the United States. As I said, when I have been in Central America, when I have been certainly in Eastern Europe, really see how this polarization and this inability to have relationships that go beyond the immediate problem at hand, they get in the way.
In business, we talk a lot about stakeholder management and answering to a variety of different stakeholders. And NGOs obviously have to balance stakeholders as well. Every institution does. But in preparing for this conversation, I've been reading some of the things that you've written and looking at some of the things you said. And you have recently talked about how, from an NGO perspective, the people who are funding you are not the ones who are benefiting from your work. And that's very different to the stakeholder management that exists within businesses in many ways. How do you manage that balance at IREX?
I mean, it's not just us, but anyone who is running a nonprofit knows that the fundamental challenge of these jobs is that if your customers are not the people who pay you, you may have audiences with very competing needs that there are incentives to please one more than the other. So let's take the example of poverty alleviation. If your customer is the actual young mother in a developing country who needs skills and access to employment, if she were your only customer and she was somehow able to pay you directly, you would tailor your programs right to her. But if actually the only way that you're able to help that young mother is by getting a grant from a funder, and the funder actually has its own agenda, and you have to do a whole set of things to please them and serve their needs because they have bosses and they have funders, of course, directs a lot of your energy and attention to the funder. So the real trick of any nonprofit is to make sure that you're not getting so focused on a day-to-day basis to meeting the needs of the funder that you forget who your real customer is, which in my example is the young mother looking for employment. But that's a tricky balance and all too easy for nonprofits to get captured and to be a little stuck in the middle of trying to juggle a lot of things at once. And all of us are better at what we're doing when our objectives are as clear and straightforward as possible. So in the perfect world, if you were trying to ensure that there was quality independent media in an increasingly authoritarian place, you would give groups of citizens money to dispense to organizations that were helping to build quality independent media. But they're not the ones with the money. In that circumstance, building trust becomes all the more important because you need to make sure that everybody knows you are delivering for them and that you are keeping your promise to them, even though you are trying to satisfy many promises at once.
And if that's not a complicated enough situation, your work and all of our work exists in a world wrought with mis and disinformation. And you talked about media, you talked about writing papers and providing information so that people are educated about the issues and the work. How do you work to get quality information out, not only to those who fund you, but also to those people you serve, to your customers?
This is a major facet of IREX's work in two respects. One is we are really working to support around the world institutions that are helping citizens get information they need to make good decisions in their lives as individuals, as citizens, as family and community members, and as professionals. And that can happen through schools or universities, libraries. It can happen through quality public media. Or we're also working to help people consume information critically. Because as you said, the entire world is awash in mis and disinformation. Misinformation is unintentional. Disinformation is intentional. There are so many problems with people being able to figure out not just what is true or not true, but what to trust and what not to trust and how to get the information they need. Some of those problems include, one, what is the business model to pay for getting people the best, most objective information they need? It has traditionally been, in the last many decades, in democracies at least, media organizations. But we all know that the business model of those organizations has collapsed. And so who is going to pay? We all know that social media companies have a business model that relies on engagement, getting people to read and share. Guess what? Because of evolution, we are wired in our brains to pay more attention to things that are provocative or make us scared or angry, and we want to share them with others when we feel that way, because that was a protective way that our communities evolved. And then also, it is not in the interests of some very powerful actors, whether they are government, business, religious, ideological, community groups, partisan groups. It is not in their interests for people to have full sides of every issue and objective quality information. In that marketplace of ideas, how are we going to make sure that individuals get a fair shake there? How do they get what they need? So one thing IREX works on, and I think now 24 countries around the world, is something called Learn to Discern. And we do not tell people what is true and not true. We do not take sides on issues. What we do is try and give people the tools to navigate a hyper-polarized information environment, check sources, understand the interests or agendas behind different groups and evaluate that for themselves, recognize their own reaction to provocative content. In a number of countries, we have piloted and run large-scale public interest campaigns called Care Before You Share, which means don't just forward things on social media if you don't know if it's true. You have a responsibility as a good citizen not to fill up your friends and neighbors and loose acquaintances' feeds with junk information. So that's something we've worked on. Many others have worked on it too. I don't think there is nearly enough focus on that, giving information consumers some power, and not power in telling them what to do or read or censor or not censor. That's a whole other conversation. A very, I think, common sense, nonpartisan solution is let's just give citizens some more tools so that they can know what information to trust and so they can be really thoughtful. It's really hard to do other things in our communities if people can't agree on the nature of facts or if people are so polarized. And disinformation and manipulative information of all sorts definitely plays into this.
Kristin, for my last question, I want to pivot a little bit. A lot of young people these days are very interested in making an impact with their career. You've had an incredible career and are continuing to have an incredible career in impact all across the world. What kind of advice would you give to folks early in their career about how to make the most impact in their roles?
Recognize that things have changed and that therefore they can change. People change them. Things that seemed impossible just 20 years ago, 30 years ago, are so common now we wouldn't even think about it. And I think one challenge that I see when young people look at the world right now is they look at climate change, inequity, political polarization, health issues and pandemics, crime, you name it. It seems conflict, war. It seems so impossible. But the truth is that these are not the first crises the world has ever gone through. And there have been many, many challenges in the past decades that people working together were able to, if not eliminate, then manage down to a level that we all don't worry about them so much anymore. William Ury recently published a book called Possible. And one of the whole points of his book is that step one is thinking that it is possible to solve the problem. And what could that simply imagining what a future could look like that could get you there. And, I still have a lot of faith in Americans and people in other communities around the world that if we could just step away from the toxic debates and you're on one side or the other, that we can solve problems. And so what I would say to young people is, you're supposed to be the optimistic ones. And I'm not blaming you for not feeling optimistic. And I'm certainly not blaming you for not feeling that you're the ones who have to be responsible for fixing what the rest of us screwed up. However, I'd say more things can change than you think. And you can do it. And many have done it before, and you can do it. This is the most talented, educated, tech-savvy generation in the history of the world. And we have the largest youth population in human history on the planet right now, alive today. It is a tremendous source of opportunity.
I love that. Kristin, that is all the time we have. Thank you for your insights and your expertise. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to The Trust Makers.
Thank you for tuning into The Trust Makers, an Edelman podcast in partnership with Advertising Week, where we speak with leaders and other trust builders across institutions. See you next time.